Hi students, in this video I'm going to give you an overview into the Age of Exploration, hopefully to give you a good guideline as to the material on this topic. The Age of Exploration is a fascinating and hugely important topic for understanding the history of Western civilization. And it's a hugely important topic for understanding the themes that are uniting the different weeks of our course in this class. First of all, the Age of Exploration is fundamental to the development of a world that is more connected and a world that is increasingly dominated by the West, by Western ideas and by Western practices and culture. And this Age of Exploration has at its foundation the development of scientific and technological advances that make the Age of Exploration possible, and it spurs further advances that also contribute to the world becoming more connected and to Western influence in the world growing. So that's why the Age of Exploration is so important to the overall landscape of the course. And now, how did this come about? Why was it that many ordinary people ordinary crew members who could have made just as much money sailing somewhere locally were willing to risk their lives on these dangerous voyages? What is it about human beings that this type of excitement appeals to them? What is it about medieval European human beings in particular that this exploration starts or happens here? For most of the medieval period, for most of the period before this course, Europeans are focused on the Mediterranean. They don't venture outside the Mediterranean. There's some trade in the Atlantic between Spain and England that starts to develop, but in the main, this is a society that's focused on the Mediterranean, that's otherwise focused on very short voyages, that has very little idea of what lies beyond the deserts of North Africa, beyond the Sahara. But it is a world and a society that's fascinated by other cultures. Any idea that the medieval Europeans were in some way insular and obsessed with their own culture is a total misconception. We see in the Crusades that Europeans are interested in what's going on in places outside of Europe. We see as a legacy of the Crusades that they become more and more interested in the societies that exist beyond the Mediterranean. And we see this with the development of the Mongol Empire in the 13th century, that the Mongol Empire provides new access for Europeans to trade and to interact with peoples in India and in China. And we see that this is absolutely fascinating to Europeans. Nevertheless, by the time we come to the second half of the 14th century and into the 15th century, we find that just as Europeans are becoming most interested in worlds and cultures outside of their own, that their access to these worlds and cultures is becoming more restricted. And there are a couple of important reasons for this. The first is the Black Death. The Black Death that takes place in the middle of the 14th century. It wrecks the Mongol Empire and it wrecks the trade and easy travel across this huge, expansive empire that the Mongols had made possible. In its place, you have restrictive tariffs, you have local warlords. Traveling through this region becomes much more dangerous. So all this is taking place in the second half of the 14th century. In the first half of the 15th century, you have the rise of a new empire in the Middle East, the Ottoman Islamic Empire, that finally succeeds in capturing Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. And this means that you have a new Muslim empire that's much less welcoming, much more uneasy about Christians in large numbers, particularly medieval European Christians in large numbers coming to the Middle East and moving through the Middle East. And so the Ottoman Empire and the Black Death both mean that the eastern route to other worlds and other cultures is becoming more closed off to medieval Europeans than it has been for centuries. And so we instead see the source of this expansion of Western influence and Western engagement with the rest of the globe coming from the Western Mediterranean, coming from Spain. and the Spanish Peninsula, a part of Europe that has a fascinating medieval history in which you see the close interaction of Christian, Muslim, and Jewish cultures. And for much of the medieval period, most of Spain is under the rule of Islamic leaders. But that there's this memory that persists in Spain, this memory that persists in the northernmost part of Spain, of a united Christian Spain. And off and on, there are efforts to restore this Christian Spanish kingdom. And these efforts are finally successful in the 15th century. In the 15th century, at exactly the same time as Constantinople is becoming closed off, you're seeing the alliance of leading Christian kingdoms in Spain and the final defeat of Muslim kingdoms in southern Spain and the final unification of Spain under Christian rulers. And so at the same time as the Eastern Mediterranean is becoming more closed off, you're also seeing the emergence of a powerful, united Spain that is, for the first time in many centuries, looking beyond the borders of the Spanish Peninsula, looking to expand its influence beyond the borders of the Spanish Peninsula. And we see this take place first with the Kingdom of Portugal. And the Portuguese, who complete the restoration of their historic Christian territories earlier than the Spanish, are the first to look outside of Europe. And their natural inclination is to look towards North Africa, where they know that trade from the Middle East is coming to this region. They think maybe it's possible that they can establish an empire there. And their early efforts to do so are a failure. Because the African kingdoms that they encounter are too strong and too sophisticated. It's very important not to fall into a pejorative trap of thinking that African kingdoms at this time were more primitive than the European kingdoms. Actually, the reverse was true. The truth was that these African kingdoms were typically larger and typically better organized than the European kingdoms they were coming in contact with. So it's not possible for the Portuguese to conquer territory in Africa. And so their mode of expansion is going to be one of trade, that they're going to establish trading enclaves down the coast of West Africa and eventually into the Indian Ocean and connecting with India and trade from India. And so this is the Portuguese age of exploration, the exploration of the coasts of Africa, the exploration of the Indian Ocean. The Spanish restoration of Spain ends in 1492, and that is no coincidence for the more famous reason that we remember 1492. We remember the year 1492 as the year that Columbus leads a Spanish voyage of exploration to the New World and to the Americas. That Spain is looking to expand its influence, it's looking beyond its borders, and so the Spanish king and queen are willing to give Columbus the backing he needs to undertake this voyage. And Columbus had been refused just about everywhere else. He had asked for political backing and funding to conduct this voyage. He had been refused. He had been refused not because people thought that the world was flat. This is a really important misconception that it's important to root out. People at the time knew that the world was round. People since the time of Aristotle had been aware, if they were educated people, had been aware that the earth was round. No one of the powerful and influential people who Columbus was seeking money from disputed this. What they disputed was Columbus's mathematics, which was demonstrably wrong. It was demonstrably the case that the world was much bigger than he was suggesting, that with the ships available to him, he would not be able to reach Asia before running out of provisions and supplies, and his crew starving to death. Now, they don't know about the continent of the Americas that's exactly around the limits of the range of ship that Columbus is going to have access to. And so in this case, it's not that Columbus was rejected by other powers because they were stupid. It was that they were just unaware of the situation for totally justifiable reasons. But because of the unique history of Spain, because of this unique meeting point of European interest in exploration and in Spanish interest in expansion, it's going to be a Spanish-backed voyage through which Europeans come in contact with the Americas, and through which this whole new chapter of the world in which Europeans are trying to understand a wider world, trying to understand their place in a wider world, seeing themselves as more backward compared to some of the African kingdoms, compared to some of the Asian kingdoms, and seeing themselves as perhaps more advanced than some of the peoples they come in contact with in the Americas. Either way, it brings them more in contact with the rest of the world. It expands Western influence and the role of Western influence in the Western world in a way that totally transforms the position of the West in the world as a whole.